All right, MOU, Memorandum of Understanding. All right, Africa is losing an estimated $600 billion to illicit financial flows and other challenges out of the $700 billion that the continent borrows globally every year. This was according to Professor Kevin Urama, chief economist at the African Development Bank, while speaking to the latest economic outlook released today at the group's meetings in Nairobi, Kenya. The new report, however, forecasts Africa's growth to stabilize at 4% between 2024 and 2025. East Africa leading the projected rebound. Here's more from Professor Urama.
A lot of what is in the report is already been well articulated by Mr. President. And here is just the structure of the report. We're looking at economic outlook of the continent, taking stock of transformation on the continent, but also looking at how to finance that transformation on the continent within the current context of the global financial architecture, and also some recommendations on what African countries need to do more and what the global financing architecture, the global community needs to do more to help that to happen. So here is the growth trends, which the President has already summarized for us. If you look at GDP growth, in terms of real GDP growth, Africa is doing very well, only second to Asia, with 10 of African countries amongst the 20 fastest growing economy. So it's just a story of resilience. If you try to look deeper, you find that up to 15 countries in Africa, estimated to be about 17 this year, post growth of more than 5 percentage points. But we know that that 5% or 4% or 3.8%, 3.1% we have this year is not enough to drive structural transformation on the continent. Our estimates is that Africa needs 7 to 10% of growth consistently for about 40 years before we can break the vicious cycles of poverty. And in this slide, just to show that this growth trend that we are seeing in terms of real GDP growth is also divergent across the countries depending on structures of economies in the regions, but also exposure to shocks, that how they can be able to bolster all the global challenges that the President had already pointed out. And the same is the story when we are looking at different economic groupings, resource-rich countries, non-resource-rich countries, and so on. And funnily enough, on the continent, the non-resource-rich countries are doing better than the resource-rich countries. Again, begging the question of what the President has talked about in terms of how we transparently use our natural capital to leverage resources for growth. And here is what I call, when you look at what I call the paradox of development on the continent, where you have rich resources, high growth rates in terms of GDP, but low performance in terms of improving the welfare of people and also addressing SDG outcomes. If you look at one indicator, which is GDP per capita, we'll find that the continent has not been doing as well as we saw with regard to GDP growth rates. The continent has trailed other regions consistently for decades in terms of GDP per capita, and that because of that, the growth rates we have not created enough jobs for youths. There's persistent poverty, there's debt vulnerability and recurrent debt distress, but also several other fragilities across the continent. And I've already said that for us to transform, we need much higher growth. Here we're looking at the growth, the dynamics within Africa's macroeconomic fundamentals, be it on inflation or depreciation in currencies. We see that Africa is also not doing very well because of several endogenous and exogenous factors. Our consumer price inflation rose this year to about 17%, up from 14% last year, and several countries saw depreciations in their local currencies because of the strengthening of the US dollar and other domestic factors. The President has already talked about the debt. The good news here is that the stock of debt is tapering. The rise of debt to GDP growth rates is tapering, estimated to be around 60% by the end of 2024. But the challenge is that the strength of the dollar has increased a lot of the spread between African countries. Since the fiscal tightening that we've seen post-COVID-19, the spread for Africa has increased 3 times more than other emerging countries. And then currency also being denominated in the dollar, about 70% of Africa's stock of debt is dollar denominated, and a lot of move away from normal, low concessional, low-cost financing to high-cost, short-term private sector financing also has strong implications for debt and debt vulnerability on the continent. And this slide is just showing us, because of all this confluence of changes in the structure of debt, we are now seeing that debt service payments for our external debt is rising so sharply that is actually taking resources away from structural transformation, economic development, and other things we need to do. The president have talked already about the 74 billion that is supposed to be paid in debt service. 40 billion of that is from the private sector. And we see also in our analysis that MDBs are actually a good model for financing structural transformation on the continent. Looking at the costs of debt, Africa pays about 500 percentage points more when they are borrowing from the international capital market than if it's borrowing from the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and other MDBs. The other challenge we are seeing is refinancing risks, which will be rising for countries that have large bullet payments due, including Kenya and several other countries. And if you look at the report, you will see all the details. And amid all these issues, now we're going into the global financing architecture, when Africa needs a lot more resources to address climate change, address all the challenges of the geopolitical tensions we're seeing. If you look at all external flows collectively, it's been declining significantly on the continent by 19.4 percentage points between 2022 and 2021.